Hello, I'm Martin Kelly, Senior Editor of Friends Journal, and I have with me Katharine Gerbner, who has an article in the current Friends Journal, Slavery in the Quaker World, subtitle Christian Slavery and White Supremacy. So thanks for being here, Katharine, and tell us, what is this about Quakers and slavery? Aren't we the good guys?
Aren't we the good guys? When I started my research, that was my assumption was that yes, of course, I went to Quaker school and I had always heard these stories about Quakers as abolitionists. And so when I first began to dig into this history, I started with the first anti-slavery protest written by Quakers in 1688. And I thought, oh, this is a great way to understand sort of the roots of the abolitionist movements, and basically to continue to see Quakers as these sort of triumphant abolitionists. But there was a rude awakening when I read through the entire document, and you get to the end of the protest and you read the responses from the other Quaker meetings. So the monthly meetings, the quarterly, and then the Philadelphia yearly meeting. And what they say is basically, oh, this is a very weighty topic, and we don't think we can, make any judgment about this, which, basically means we don't agree, we can't do anything to actually implement any anti-slavery policies. And I thought that was shocking. So, as I sort of recount in my article, that became sort of the question for me, is how should I think we need to understand sort of early Quaker anti-slavery thought within the broader context of Quakers and slavery and Quakers as slave owners, because as I discovered, there were thousands of slave-owning Quakers in the 17th century.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit how that came to be. I mean, Quakers, they're sheep farmers in the north of England. How did they come to be slaveholders?
Well, as Quakers moved around the Atlantic world, many people went to various colonies. So Barbados, we have Quakers in Rhode Island, of course, so this is before Pennsylvania's been founded. And some of them may have sort of gone as Quakers and then sort of adopted sort of the lifestyle of other, white English people, and that included slaveholding. Other people may have been slaveholders already, and then they were later became convinced Quakers. So, it was just, and that is, I think, especially true in Barbados, where two female Quakers arrive in this 1650s and convince several slave owners to become Quakers. And so there you may have the slave owning before the Quaker convincement. In other cases, it's the other way around. But again, this was sort of this was sadly standard practice at the time. English slaveholding was widespread, and the slave trade was growing throughout the colonies, and that's both north and south. So slavery exists in New England, in New York, eventually went in Pennsylvania, as well as colonies farther south, whether Maryland, Virginia, or Barbados, which of course, as I write about, was a crucially important central English colony that often gets dropped out of our histories because it doesn't become one of the colonies that joins the revolution and becomes part of the United States, but it's actually
doesn't become the myth there that we have. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So, but it is of absolutely central importance, especially in the 17th century.
Sure. And Friends were also involved in things like the slave trade and funding the ships. And it's not just, even the ones who weren't owning slaves were still benefiting, many of them.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, a lot of the reason behind this, the discomfort on the part of these, especially the English Quakers who control the Philadelphia yearly meeting when they get this anti-slavery protest. It has, I think the direct quotation is, it has too general a relation to the other parts, right? Which is so abstract, too general a relation, but you read into it and you're like, everyone's benefiting from this slave trade and from slavery. Oh, everyone, I should be more specific, white Quakers. And therefore, there may be some discomfort here and there, but they're going to go with the sort of the general consensus, which is not to do anything and to continue to import enslaved people and to hold enslaved people in bondage.
We asked some people out on Twitter and Facebook to ask some questions for this, and we had one here, so I'm going to read it because I think it's appropriate now. Joe Guada on Twitter asked, I wonder how Quakers who had enslaved people justified doing so within Quaker theology and thinking at the time, and was it similar to other Christians who believed there was a biblical basis for enslaving others?
Yeah, I saw that question and I've been thinking about it because I went back through some of the texts, Quaker texts from the period, and you really don't actually see a full-throated biblical defense of slavery among Quakers, like you do kind of in the 19th century with pro-slavery apologists. So, they're not saying, well, the curse of Ham, therefore, says that we can enslave people of African descent. Or that's not generally in the Quaker writings at the time. Instead, you see sort of, in some cases, more of a defensive reaction. So, I talk about how Quakers were radical in the 17th century, not because they were abolitionists, but because they wanted to evangelize and worship together with enslaved people. And so there you see them getting attacked by other slave owners, and their response is often, well, Christianity will make enslaved people more peaceful and obedient, right? So there you have it's a defense of slavery, but it sort of comes within this context of them being attacked for their evangelization and for their missions. And then, in George Fox's writings, you again, the emphasis isn't on how to defend the practice of slavery. It's he is building a biblical argument for why Friends should include the enslaved people who are in their households, within their meetings and within their worship services. And so there is an absolutely sort of developed biblical consideration of slavery, but it is articulated in a way that's not necessarily sort of the apologist defense of slavery that we would expect from the 19th century slave owners.
Right, I got the impression, it was sort of this Old Testament biblical, there's a village and there's a patriarch of the village, and their job is to protect everyone and to make sure everyone is being religious. And but you kind of wonder what's going through George Fox's head. He's come to Barbados, he's thinking that this is more kindly and there can be this kindly slave owner, and then he's also staying, I believe, with his son-in-law or stepson-in-law. Margaret Fell's daughter married him, and he's a major slave owner. So George Fox, is he a hero or a villain in this story? It seems kind of progressive that he's saying, okay, the slaves can worship with us, that we shouldn't erect barriers. So how did that happen, and how can we feel about George Fox? He says yes, people can come into Quakers, but doesn't have any conflict with slavery as it's there, and he's there for months and he doesn't say anything against it.
I mean, I think that we can feel disappointed. I think that I can read into his writings. I think there is that he is uncomfortable with what he sees in Barbados. I think it takes him. He gets to Barbados in 1671. He's sick initially for a month, so he's been there for several weeks by the time he gives this sort of statements, which later becomes Gospel Family Order, which is his sort of most defined stance against, or not against slavery, about slavery. And so I think that Barbados at that time, there's just an immense amount of cruelty in the system of slavery. He would have seen that, and I think that he probably felt a little hemmed in by the fact that at the time, all but 4 Quakers, white Quakers living in Barbados, were slave owners. And so, I can imagine that maybe if he did feel uncomfortable with the practice of slavery, he wasn't going to fully articulate that. And so if that's the case, I would say that that's a bit of a failure on his part not to sort of take the extra step, and maybe sort of to the detriment of the expansion of Quakerism, make a more principled stand against slavery. But again, it's very hard to sort of imagine the 17th century completely, and to put ourselves in the mind of George Fox. I mean, anyone who's read his writings, they're kind of disorienting, and
Yes.
They go all over the place. I personally can't always follow where he's going, and so I can't say that I know exactly what he was thinking, but I do get the sense that he felt discomfort, but he decided not to make a stance that maybe he was thinking of making.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that you get into in your book is that George Fox came and said that the enslaved Africans should worship with friends. And this was sort of revolutionary in the Protestant world, and was something that got picked up later on by Anglican missionaries and Moravians. And you talk a lot about that. But what's interesting is that Quakers didn't really seem to pick it up, that it didn't seem like there were many, African slaves that were coming into Quaker worship, and that just didn't happen, even though this was kind of Fox's major development in this, and something that other denominations did pick up. Even, there are some African Americans in, Jamaica and such, but those were later missions. So this whole idea of bringing in the enslaved Africans and saying, yes, you can be Christian, you can be Quaker, didn't happen. Any ideas why they didn't follow through on that side of George Fox's story?
I have a few thoughts on that. So it's true that this was Fox's sort of radical argument at the time, to worship together with enslaved people. But then when you read through all of Gospel Family Order, I mean, frankly, most of it is a critique of the behavior of enslaved people. So, and this is he's sort of obsessed with what's monogamous marriage, and sort of what he considers to be sort of disreputable behavior. So and it's they're very kind of typical, if you've read a lot of like white missionaries, typical critiques of what is basically another culture, another set of values and systems. And so I can imagine that for an enslaved person, this is, if they don't want to necessarily hear all of this moralizing, but it was a very moralistic, it's very moralistic writing. So I think that is probably one aspect of the answer to this, to your question. The second thing is that, in later missions, sacraments like baptism are very popular when enslaved people choose to convert to Christianity. And of course, Quakers are not offering that. So I've often thought that may have been actually one of the reasons that another reason they don't become more popular among enslaved populations. But then the third reason, I think, has to do with the way that anti-slavery thought developed within Quaker communities. Again, this is anti-slavery and abolition are the things that we sort of herald as wonderful things, and Quakers were at the forefront of these movements once they do sort of embrace anti-slavery and abolition.
100 years later, when they finally fully embrace it,
Right. But if you look at especially the earliest anti-slavery tracts, so not the 1688 protest, but other ones from the late 17th century and early 18th centuries, a lot of the reason that white Quakers are uncomfortable with slavery actually has to do with their discomfort with Black people, and so we have Morgan Cadwallader and Robert Pyles sort of developing these anti-slavery arguments that are more about excluding people of African descent from their communities than they are about actually believing that all humans are deserving of sort of equal treatment and freedom. And that's sort of an aspect of Quaker anti-slavery that, again, hasn't been sort of, I can understand why people don't sort of talk about it as much, but I think that helps to explain some of another aspect of this, the reason that probably enslaved and free Blacks would not have chosen to join the Quaker meetings.
Yeah. And it's sort of, if you're kind of student history, it echoes down the lane too. You have the Indian boarding schools, and they were also, there was sort of a positiveness to it, but then there was also a lot of assimilation, a lot of patronizing. You have a couple of major Quakers who were big into eugenics, and some sort of frightful stories of, sort of well-known Quakers who were doing that. So there's this kind of, on one hand, we're liberatory and doing all this stuff, but also these problems that feel somewhat similar this way. Just sort of to close out, what's the next kind of thing that you're researching, or that you think someone might research about Quakers and slavery? What's kind of another bit of history that's kind of gnawing at you, or something that we should be thinking about more, that, sort of your average friends today should be more aware about?
Well, I guess, I have been thinking a lot about what the implications are of this research. What does it really mean to rewrite sort of our narratives about Quakerism, to integrate sort of these more troubling aspects of Quaker history? And I think that's, I've thought about it obviously a lot, but I think that there's sort of a lot more to be done in terms of really thinking through what we can learn from this, and how it can help us sort of better navigate our present moments, right? So because I think one of the great failings of these early white Quakers was they were radical, but they weren't fair. They didn't really they didn't think through and fully embrace sort of concepts of equality. And I think that there are probably ways in which we continue to sort of both embrace equality, but also not do all of the work in order to really make that happen. So I guess I would say connecting the past and the present, and thinking about, how we can challenge ourselves to be more truly radical today.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here with us today. Again, this is Katharine Gerbner, Slavery in a Quaker World, in the Current Friends Journal, and also online at friendsjournal.org. So you can read there and comment. There's also plenty of comments, one of the more commented articles of the year. And I think it may be one of the most well-read too. It's just right up there. So when we have our top 5 most read countdown at the end of the year, I'm pretty sure this will be there. So thank you for writing this for us, and thank you for doing this video interview.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.